I was just out shooting here at Nobska, and it got really out of control. I mean, really out of control. Hello, my friends. My name is Tim Little. I am a nighttime landscape artist living on the east coast of Massachusetts, and this is Cape Cod After Dark, a web series devoted to helping you find fantastic places on Cape Cod to visit, as illustrated through some of the photographs I've captured there. So you've already seen a little bit from the night that we're going to be talking about, and I've hinted at the location. It's Nobska Lighthouse in the Woods Hole, Falmouth area. And I have to tell you that that night, out of all the nights that I've done photography here on the Cape, was the most surprising because it went from one situation to another rather quickly. And at the time, I had enough forethought to get my cell phone camera out and start recording some video to commemorate the experience. I figured if it was the last video I ever took, then people would know what happened to me down there. But it was not, and thankfully I survived, despite having a rather shocking experience. Sorry for the pun. Down there at Nobska Light. So we're going to talk about the image that I captured there tonight. I'm going to show you some extended video from that night so you can kind of get a sense of how that all played out. And then I'm also going to tell you a little bit about another image that I captured there involving a moonrise and why it is such a great location under those conditions to do photography. But before we get into any of that, for those of you who have not been to Nobska Light before, or for those of you who have but haven't been in a while, here is a refresher. Nobska Light, also known as Nobska Point Light, is located in the Woods Hole area on the southwestern tip of Cape Cod at 233 Nobska Road. The current structure was lit in 1876 after replacing the original tower. It measures 42 feet tall and houses a fourth order Fresnel lens dating all the way back to 1888. In 1985, the lighthouse was automated and just 2 years later was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. After being used as the residence for the commanding officer of the Coast Guard Sector Southeastern New England, Nobska is now on its way to becoming a maritime museum, thanks to a partnership between the town of Falmouth and the Friends of Nobska Light. Nobska provides expansive views of Vineyard Sound and Martha's Vineyard. Boat watchers will frequently see the ferries operated by the Steamship Authority moving passengers to and from the island and other interesting maritime traffic. Nobska Light is one of the Cape's most easily accessible lighthouses, with some of the best sunset and sunrise views to be found anywhere on the Upper Cape. The first image we're going to talk about tonight is one of my personal favorites for a lot of reasons. It seems to be a lot of other people's favorite image as well. There's a big story behind it. It's one of those accidents, not like the accident I told you about last week when we were talking about the boardwalk and making a mistake with lighting. This was more of an accident of timing, being at the right place at the right time, but just not knowing it until the moment happened. I was happy to survive this particular instance because we were dealing with a scenario that was maybe one of three situations in my life as a photographer that made me feel somewhat unsafe. But when you have the opportunity to create an image from a moment in time that cannot be duplicated, you sometimes make those decisions because you think it's a good idea at the time. Would I make that decision again? I don't know. Would I recommend you make that decision? No. But if you do find yourself in that same scenario, after talking about this image and giving you some insight, you might be able to get something similar. So we're going to be talking about Nob Flash. That's the name I have given this photo. And this was shot back in 2011 on what was probably the weirdest weather night I had ever seen on the Cape in that area. And it was completely unexpected, like I said. So here's the scenario. I decided to go down and shoot Nobska Light. It's 10 minutes from my house. So it's one of those, I would call it a low-hanging fruit location for me because I can get there pretty quick. Also, I like to use it for trying out new equipment, trying out new lenses, new camera bodies, and you really can't get a bad image down there any time of the day. Sunset, sunrises, moonlight, starlight. I'd gone down there on that particular night to shoot the Moonrise. So I got all set up and I was facing east with my back to the west. Now, as that's happening, I am not paying attention to the strobing lights that are coming fairly quickly from the west and would soon get over Woods Hole. I was on my way down there and I called another photographer and I said, hey, do you want to meet me down there and we can get some photographs? So I was expecting him to show up. I figured I'd just kind of burn some time while I was waiting for that to happen. So it didn't take long for me to realize something was happening. I could start to hear a little bit of rumble behind me. And a lot of times when you start to hear the rumble and you're not expecting it, you think, is that thunder? That kind of sounds like thunder. Yeah, it turns out it was thunder. And that storm was coming really quickly. I don't think I've seen a thunderstorm show up on a location that quickly before. So I think I messaged my friend and said, hey, there's a big thunderstorm coming. If you get here, I'll just be in my truck, because I was obviously concerned about the lightning, but also the rain. This was back when a lot of cameras did not have the weatherproofing that we enjoy now on a lot of the newer cameras. But I knew I had a little bit of time, so I went across the street to that little sitting area with the memorial stone, because I could frame the lightning just right as it was coming across the harbor in Woods Hole, and that would give me time to just sort of tweak my settings and figure out exactly what I needed to use, because if that lightning got to the point where I could incorporate it into a photograph, I might not have a lot of opportunity to get it right. So this was sort of my testing time. I could also see the rain coming down. Now, for reference, this was at about 9:30, 9:45 at night when all this started. So the image that you see here was primarily lit by lightning and lit slightly by the house next to the lighthouse structure that had a floodlight on it. So let's talk about that for just a second. Let's talk about lightning. Besides being, super dangerous, it is very hard to photograph. Chances are, if you're a photographer, if you've captured lightning before, it was by accident. They make all sorts of different pieces of technology for you to be able to capture lightning during the day. They're called lightning triggers, or some sort of variant of that name. Essentially, they hook up to your camera. They have a sensor suite or some sort of photovoltaics. And when the lightning flashes, it triggers your shutter. And you really don't have to do anything other than kind of know what direction you want to face, figure your composition out. And then you just wait for that moment. But here's the beauty of night photography. The great thing about night photography is you can open your shutter and wait for the lightning to come to you. That means that you can be patient and you can be a little bit more deliberate. And you also can make some decisions as far as how much of that lightning you want in there. So lightning is a light source. And with night photography, it's all about light sources. Well, any kind of photography, but with night photography, everything's a lot slower because you're building the light into that image over time. So if you find yourself in a super dark area and you've got some lightning, if it's distant lightning, you could let a couple flashes come through and that's probably enough. But if it's really close lightning, maybe you only need one flash to go through. And if you're shooting a location like this, a lighthouse, which is producing its own light, you might not have as big of a window as you would have otherwise in darker locations. So this exposure was 10 seconds. I figured out that 10 seconds was about as long as I could keep that shutter open for before the lighthouse started to blow out its brightness, its own brightness from the floodlight next door. And I figured that out pretty quickly. So what I did in this particular case was I just kept repeating 10-second exposures over and over and over again. Think of a time lapse, very similar to something like that. What that allowed me to do is to just be open exposure-wise every possible second. So every burst or flash of lightning that happened was going to be recorded in that image. Now, if you're a photographer, there are two other settings you're probably wondering about. What about aperture and ISO? So quickly on that, as far as the aperture goes, when you're shooting towards a light source with night photography, it's really best that you figure out a way to control what I would call a blowout. So if you're shooting towards a street light or a floodlight, the higher the aperture value, so f11, f16, the more squeezed or compressed that light source should look. You might even get a starburst effect. And you have to also apply that to scenarios like lightning or fireworks. Now, if I was going to do Milky Way shooting and I didn't have a lot of light in front of me, but I wanted that light, as much of it as I could get, I might do f2.8 or 1.8. But I have determined that for lightning and for fireworks, the best range for me is somewhere between f8 and f11. It allows enough light to come in, but it doesn't really create that much of a blowout. So not so much light gets spread across the image from the light source. In this particular case, I was shooting f8. The ISO setting for this image was ISO 400. And that worked out really well in this case because it was sensitive enough to allow the light that I wanted to come through over the course of the 10 seconds, but it wasn't so sensitive that it was causing overexposures as a result of the floodlight being on the entire time. Now, one thing that would cause an overexposure would have been too much lightning. And I did have that happen in a couple shots. And those are the ones where I thought I was going to die because the lightning was right over the lighthouse. And with lightning comes a loud clap of thunder. And if you're a science person or you've been out in a thunderstorm before, you know that the difference in time between lightning and thunder should not be instantaneous in your world. Otherwise, you're probably in a lot of trouble. And that's what was happening in this shot. So I'll never forget that. I really thought that if this was the end and these were the last images I got and they found the camera with these images, that would be a great legacy. I wouldn't be around to enjoy it, however. Anyway, that said, one other question I get about this image is, was the lightning really that color that night? The answer is yes. This is exactly how the lightning appeared to my eyes on that particular night. And there are a lot of reasons why lightning would be a different color from storm to storm. And that could be because of dust content in the atmosphere. So how much dust you're looking at between your eye and the lightning, how much water vapor, how much rain, all of these things to affect how the colors reach your eye. And realistically, everything was happening so fast that I had a general sense of what I thought the colors would look like. But lightning is fast at night, just like it is during the day. So although I had more time based on the rest of the lighting to get my exposure done, my eye wasn't any quicker at discerning what was actually happening. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there who do color pushing on their photography, so they really kind of beef it up in an HDR sort of sense to make it look more poppy. So when you're going through your Instagram feed, you've got this super false color looking oversaturated thing, which, I mean, it works. It gets people to stop. But I'm all for organic. And if you can tell a story through an amazing image or moment through your mind's eye, but using your own eye as a guide, I always think that is the best way to go. As promised, I'm going to show you the video now that I shot back in 2011. It's about 1 minute and 40 seconds. And this was really meant to give people an idea what it was that I was sitting through, because at the time I thought no one's going to believe this. No one is going to believe how crazy this lightning storm is. In the middle of this, my friend Pat does finally show up and he's all gung-ho and he gets out. He's ready to start shooting. The rain's coming through and it all happened really quickly. And I'm glad I saved that video. This is one of those moments where I'm so happy that I don't delete anything. We talked a little bit about that last week, why it's always a bad idea to delete anything because you may want to go back and revisit that moment at some point. And this was one of those moments that I dug up recently that inspired me making this whole episode to begin with. So here we are going back in time to 2011 as witnessed from me in my truck, the big lightning storm at Nobska Light.
All right, so this is called the Dangers of Night Photography. I was just out shooting here at Nobska, and it got really out of control. I mean, really out of control. I basically ran to my car just in time to see probably one of the most severe lightning displays I've ever seen on Cape Cod, and it is nonstop. I did get some shots, so that was good before it completely overtook. Wow. But all in all, cooler heads prevailed, and getting in the car was a much better idea than sitting this one out on the ground next to my tripod like I was a few minutes ago. I think Patrick's on his way up here, another photographer. He was supposed to meet me up here, assuming that we could take some pictures, but that's not going to happen at this point. So let's see who we got here. All right, that's one crazy dude with green flames on his car. Patrick is gonna brave the elements to get out and check this out. Rockin', man. Hey man, what's going on?
Good. I've never shot lightning, so I gotta do this.
The next image we're going to be talking about was shot also in the month of June, just 2 years before, in 2009. And it was a night in which the supermoon was rising over Vineyard Sound. I thought this would be a great opportunity to capture something like this, which I have aptly named Nobska Moon. So you should notice that the conditions are very different on two accounts. One is the sky is obviously very different. We have a nice moon coming up, but we also have the lighting around the top of the lighthouse fully lit, which creates this very bright structure scenario. That can create problems in some scenarios. In this case, it worked out really well for me. Let me explain. From our point of view, the moon is moving its own width about every 2 minutes, which makes it very, very difficult to get a nice, crisp, sort of solid moon in your shot. I always tell the people who attend my workshops, when it comes to the moon, you have to decide whether or not the moon is your light source or it is your subject. It's a lot easier if it's your light source, because then it doesn't matter how much it moves. It's not the focal point. You'll see in a lot of my work that the moon will appear as sort of like a whitish, yellowish, glowing orb that has no features. And this is because it has moved during the shot. And my intention is to not give you this crisp looking moon. It's to provide light for whatever it is that your eye should be drawn to. Probably a lighthouse or a harbor or a boat or something along those lines here on the Cape. But in this particular case, I was able to get a good looking moon at the same time I got a good looking lighthouse. And here is the trick to that. First off, you obviously want to make sure that your subject matter is going to align with the rising moon. So there's a little planning involved there. Now, back then, there weren't a lot of apps to tell you that. As somebody who's into amateur astronomy, I know where things are going to be most of the time. But now you can download all sorts of things for your iPhone or your Android or your MacBook or Windows that'll give you an idea how to plan out your shoot. But on this particular night, I pretty much knew where things were going to be. What a lot of people don't know about this image is that I was not alone. With night work, if you're shooting at 1 or 2 in the morning, you're usually alone. But if you're shooting a moonrise, chances are it's around twilight, and there's a good chance that there are people around. In this case, there were a bunch of people around. I think they were all together, and I asked them to move. I'm not above that, but I am also super polite, and I just say, hey, I'm just trying to get this shot. Would you mind just scooting over to the left, maybe about 20 feet, just for a few minutes? And then I'll let you know when I'm done. And people are totally cool with it. And I really appreciate that. If you're somebody who did that for me and you're watching this, please know that I thank you so much for that opportunity. That said, the moon's coming up and you have that short amount of time to get that image, because remember, it's always moving. And with a short shot, you will not have a lot of light available to you except for what is either producing light or something that you can shine a light on. The good news is both of the subjects within this shot both had self-illumination. I was able to do a very short exposure. And by very short, I'm talking, I think this was about 3 seconds. It was long enough to get the moon frozen in place and not have the lighthouse get blown out or be underexposed. It worked perfectly. Also, it was right after sunset, which you really can't tell here because the rest of everything, the sky specifically, is slightly underexposed. But that worked. This is also why you don't see any stars in this shot, was because the exposure was not long enough to really resolve the stars that had started to appear. So again, you've got to decide whether or not the moon is your light source or it's your subject, unless you have a rare opportunity like this, where you can combine a nicely lit foreground and the self-illuminated moon together for that short exposure. Remember, the moon determines how long the exposure is going to be, and it doesn't like to get its photograph taken. I always tell people the moon wants nothing to do with your photography. It's out of there. It's just going to keep on going. It doesn't care. So find these types of conditions. Other perfect scenarios would be moon over cities like Boston or New York. right around twilight. So you still might have some good immediate foreground lighting if you need it. Or right before dawn, same type of scenario. Again, it's just a matter of planning. And if you can do everything right in that way and you have the opportunity, you should. Now, I know a lot of people have to do things called composites, which is where you essentially take a picture of the foreground, then you take a picture of the moon and you put them together. And maybe there is no other opportunity but for you to do that. That happens and it's understandable. Where people get into trouble is where they add a moon that was not in the shot to begin with. And I see that a ton on Instagram. There are telltale signs. A moon over water should always have a reflection. Keep an eye out for those on Instagram. There are a lot of moons over water with no reflection where it should be. Or the moon is producing no light. The moon should be diffusing light into the sky. And it doesn't in some people's photography. So that tells me that that moon really wasn't there. Or abnormally long shots where you've got star trailing and a super sharp moon. Those two things shouldn't go together. Kind of messes with your eye a little bit. So again, with the right planning and the right subject, you can get all that to work organically and walk away with something that looks really, really good. And again, is natural to what your eye saw. I hope you enjoyed our trip down to Nobska Lighthouse. Again, one of my favorite locations. I'm a little biased because it's in the town in which I live and it's 10 minutes away, but it's easy to get to. And the photography opportunities there are limitless. So please make a point of visiting if you haven't been there. And if you haven't been there lately, go check it out because they've done a ton of work to the exterior. It looks like a brand new lighthouse, and I am excited for when they get it open and we can all see what they did to the interior. That said, I will put links to the 2 images I feature today down in the description so you can see them on my website. And of course, as always, if there are any images from my website, Instagram, or Facebook that you've seen that you want to know more about, let me know in the comments. And if I pick that for a future episode, I'm going to send you a free 8x10 print for the suggestion. Hey, if you like this video, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell to be notified of future content. Thanks for watching.